The bullet wasn't what made the old veteran dive for cover. It was what his German shepherd uncovered seconds later that had stayed hidden for 100 years. A rifle crack split the mountain air, sending bark exploding from the tree beside Caleb as Koda lunged through thick ferns, refusing to leave a patch of rocky ground. Caleb hit the cold earth, his pulse pounding, while a rusted metal corner pushed through the moss where the dog kept digging. Someone else was already moving through the trees. But what were they trying so desperately to keep buried? Before we begin, where are you watching from today? The first sound Caleb Mercer heard every morning was never birdsong. It was silence. The kind of silence that made a man wonder whether anyone in the world remembered he was still alive. His old Ford pickup sat beneath a weathered maple behind a closed feed store outside a small Appalachian town. Rust spread across the wheel wells like dried blood, and the camper shell leaked whenever rain rolled through the mountains. It wasn't much, but after losing the farmhouse he'd shared with his wife of 42 years, it had become the only address he had left. Koda lifted his head before Caleb even opened his eyes. The German shepherd listened first. Then Caleb did. Old habits refused to die. He remained perfectly still for several seconds, measuring every unfamiliar sound. A delivery truck rumbled somewhere beyond the highway. Wind brushed across dead grass. A pair of crows argued from an old telephone pole. Nothing close. Only then did Caleb reach for the flashlight resting beside his sleeping bag. His fingers found it automatically. He hated that they still did. Nearly 20 years had passed since Afghanistan, yet the smallest noise could pull him halfway back without warning. Sometimes it was a slamming door, sometimes fireworks, sometimes the sharp metallic crack of a trailer hitch dropping onto concrete. His heart always reached the battlefield before his mind remembered he had already come home. Koda nudged Caleb's shoulder with his nose. "I'm up," Caleb murmured. The dog thumped his tail once. Their mornings followed the same rhythm every day. Caleb folded the sleeping bag into a tight roll. He wiped condensation from the inside of the windows. Before opening the truck door, he checked both side mirrors, then slowly scanned the tree line beyond the parking lot. Left. Right. High ground. Movement. Nothing. Only after satisfying instincts older than reason did he step onto the cold gravel. The mountain air carried the smell of damp pine and wood smoke drifting from distant cabins. Koda stretched, shaking loose bits of straw clinging to his coat, before walking a slow circle around the truck. Perimeter clear. Caleb smiled faintly. "You still think you're on patrol?" Maybe they both did. Breakfast consisted of instant oatmeal heated over a small camp stove balanced on the lowered tailgate. Caleb poured half of it into Koda's battered metal bowl before eating his own. He never minded giving the larger portion away. The dog had never once abandoned him. People had. After his wife, Ellen, lost her battle with cancer, the hospital bills had swallowed everything they had spent decades building. The mortgage followed, then the auction. Friends promised to call. Most never did. Caleb picked up odd repair jobs whenever local ranchers needed fences mended or old tractors coaxed back to life. Years as an Army combat engineer had taught him how almost anything mechanical fit together. It just hadn't taught him how to rebuild a life. His prepaid phone buzzed against the tailgate. An unfamiliar number. He nearly ignored it. Instead, he answered. "Mr. Mercer?" A woman's calm voice carried the careful tone professionals used when discussing unpleasant business. "This is Linda Chambers from Chambers Probate Services." Caleb frowned. "I think you've got the wrong Mercer." "I don't believe I do." She paused. "I'm calling regarding your great-uncle, Walter Mercer." The name stirred something distant. A tall man with rough hands, The smell of cedar. One Christmas nearly 60 years ago. Nothing more. I'm afraid he passed away last month. Caleb looked down at the gravel. I didn't even know he was still alive. There was no immediate family remaining. Another pause. He named you as sole beneficiary. Caleb almost laughed. I don't have relatives leaving me fortunes. I'm afraid this isn't exactly a fortune. She explained that Walter had owned 140 acres deep in the Appalachian backcountry. Remote. Difficult to access. No utilities. No active residents. An abandoned ranger cabin listed in poor condition. Property taxes barely kept current. Most importantly, no one else wanted it. You may refuse the inheritance if you choose. Caleb remained quiet. Finally, he asked, "What's wrong with the land?" "As far as we know?" Linda sighed softly. "Nothing except that it's isolated and considered practically worthless." Worthless. The word lingered. Funny. People had started using it around him too. Not directly. Just in different ways. Too old to hire. Too expensive to insure. Too broken to fix. Too forgotten to notice. "I'll take a look," Caleb said. 2 days later, the pickup climbed narrow mountain roads that twisted through endless forests. Fog drifted between dark ridges. Old barns leaned beneath the weight of decades. Telephone signals disappeared 1 mile after another. Koda, usually content to nap during long drives, refused to settle down. Instead, he stood with both front paws on the passenger seat. His ears pointed toward the windshield. His nose worked constantly. Several miles before the property line, he gave a low, uncertain whine. Caleb glanced over. "What is it, buddy?" Koda didn't look at him. He kept staring toward the mountains ahead, as though he recognized something neither maps nor memories could explain. For the first time since receiving the phone call, Caleb no longer felt like he was driving toward abandoned land. He felt like someone, or something, had been waiting for them. The gravel road narrowed until branches brushed both sides of the pickup. Fallen leaves swirled behind the tires, and thick fog drifted between towering oaks and white pines. According to the county map, the property line began another quarter-mile ahead. Koda let out another low whine. Not frightened. Focused. His ears stood rigid as he stared through the windshield. Caleb slowed to little more than walking speed. Years ago, roads like this often ended where maps stopped making sense. Convoys learned to expect surprises after every blind curve. Old instincts whispered again. Never rush unfamiliar ground. The rusted iron gate finally appeared between 2 stone pillars almost hidden beneath climbing ivy. One hinge had broken decades earlier, allowing the gate to lean sideways. A weathered wooden sign still clung to one post. The faded lettering was barely readable. Mercer Ridge. Caleb stepped from the truck. Cold mountain air carried the scent of wet earth and pine resin. Koda immediately circled the clearing instead of staying beside him. The dog's nose remained low, weaving slowly across the ground before suddenly stopping. He looked uphill. Caleb followed his gaze. Nothing moved. Still. The back of his neck tightened. He unlocked the old chain and carefully pushed the gate aside. It groaned like an old ship. The pickup crawled deeper into the property. The forest opened unexpectedly. Caleb eased off the brake. This doesn't make sense. The valley spread before him in quiet layers. Stone retaining walls crossed the hillsides. Terraces stepped down toward a narrow creek. Rows of twisted apple trees still stood where an orchard had once flourished. Someone had shaped this landscape with enormous effort. Nature had reclaimed it, but not completely. The workmanship remained. He parked beside a weathered cabin whose roof sagged beneath moss and years of neglect. Its windows were broken. One shutter swung gently in the breeze, yet the chimney still stood perfectly straight. Caleb walked slowly toward the porch. Instead of climbing the steps immediately, he paused several yards away. He studied the entire structure first. Roofline, windows, possible entry points, ground beneath the porch. His eyes moved without conscious thought. Old habits. Always observe before approaching. Only after satisfying himself that the cabin showed no immediate danger did he step onto the porch. The boards creaked beneath his boots. Inside, dust covered nearly everything. A cast-iron stove occupied one corner. Handmade shelves lined another wall. An old rocking chair rested beside the fireplace as though someone had stood up only yesterday. Koda never entered. Instead, he barked once from outside. Sharp, short. Caleb turned immediately. The German shepherd stood nearly 50 yards away beside a weathered stone rising from the earth. Not a headstone. Not exactly. More like an old survey monument, covered in moss. Koda circled it once, twice, then sat beside it, waiting. Caleb walked over. "You find something?" The stone reached only knee-height. Most of its surface had disappeared beneath lichen. He brushed away loose moss with his glove. Faint chisel marks emerged. Numbers. Letters. Too worn to read clearly. Koda pressed his nose against the base before stepping back. When Caleb turned toward the cabin, the dog refused to follow. Instead, Koda remained beside the marker, watching him. "You really don't want to leave this thing." Finally, the shepherd obeyed, though reluctantly. He glanced back 3 separate times. As afternoon faded into evening, Caleb gathered fallen branches for a small fire outside the cabin rather than sleeping indoors. Open ground offered better visibility. He positioned the truck so one side overlooked the valley, while the opposite faced the forest. Another old habit. Never allow blind approaches. After heating canned stew over the flames, he shared half with Koda. The mountains settled into complete darkness. No distant traffic. No airplanes. Only wind. For a few precious minutes, the quiet almost felt peaceful. Then it came. A sharp metallic clang. Far away. Somewhere across the valley. Not thunder. Not falling rock. Steel striking steel. Caleb froze. The spoon slipped from his hand. In an instant, memory replaced the mountains. A generator rattled outside a forward operating base. Metal barriers slammed together. Someone shouted coordinates. The smell of hot dust and diesel filled his lungs before he even realized he was no longer seeing the fire in front of him. "Keller!" The voice echoed from years ago. Then, Koda shoved his muzzle firmly into Caleb's arm. The vision shattered. The campfire returned. The mountains returned. His breathing slowed. "It's okay," he whispered, though he wasn't certain whether he meant himself or the dog. Koda remained pressed against his side, listening, not toward Caleb, toward the darkness beyond the trees. The metallic sound came again. Once. Then silence. Caleb stood. Every instinct told him the noise hadn't come from abandoned machinery shifting with age. Someone, or something, was moving somewhere inside the valley. Caleb stood beside the dying fire until the first gray light spread across the ridgeline. Nothing else disturbed the silence. No footsteps. No voices. No more metallic clang. Still, he never slept again. By sunrise, the coffee pot sat empty beside the camp stove, and Koda had already completed 3 slow circles around the cabin. Each time the dog paused, he lifted his nose toward the same distant ridge before quietly returning. Caleb noticed. He always noticed. After packing a small notebook into his jacket, he locked the cabin and drove toward the nearest town. He needed supplies, but more than that, he needed answers. The mountain road twisted for nearly 40 minutes before the trees gave way to a narrow valley community where time seemed to move more slowly than everywhere else. A faded sign welcomed visitors to Ash Hollow. Population 684. The general store sat beside a weathered gas station whose pumps looked older than Caleb's truck. As soon as he stepped inside, the smell of fresh coffee and cedar greeted him. An elderly woman stood behind the counter arranging jars of homemade preserves. She looked up. Her hands froze. "You wouldn't happen to be a Mercer?" Caleb stopped. "I am." For several seconds, she simply stared. Then a gentle smile appeared. "I knew it." She walked around the counter and extended a weathered hand. "Martha Ellis." Caleb shook it. "You knew my family?" "I knew Walter." Her eyes drifted toward the mountains beyond the front window. "He came through every month for more years than I can count." Caleb blinked. "I thought he lived alone." "He did. But he was never lonely." Martha filled a paper cup with fresh coffee and handed it to Caleb before he could refuse. No charge. He accepted it quietly. He always asked the same question. "What was that?" She smiled. "Has anyone forgotten the valley yet?" Caleb frowned. "I don't understand." "Neither did I." She lowered her voice. "But every time he left, he'd remind me of one thing." She looked Caleb directly in the eyes. "If anyone named Mercer ever comes back, tell them not to give up the land." The words settled heavily between them. Outside, Koda suddenly lifted his head from beside the truck. His ears pointed toward the street. A dark SUV rolled slowly past the store. The driver never looked inside. Yet the vehicle continued unusually slowly before disappearing around the next corner. Caleb memorized the license plate without thinking. Another old habit. Inside, Martha seemed to notice his distraction. "You've already met someone?" "Maybe." She studied his face for a long moment before nodding toward the back wall. "You should talk to Noah." "Who's Noah?" "Noah Pierce, the retired Forest Service ranger. He knows those mountains better than anyone alive. He and Walter were friends." She scribbled an address onto the back of a grocery receipt. "You'll find him repairing fences more often than sitting inside." Caleb thanked her and purchased canned food, batteries, lantern fuel, and basic medical supplies. As he stepped outside, Koda remained standing beside the driver's door, watching the road. The SUV had vanished, but the dog wasn't satisfied. Neither was Caleb. 15 minutes later, he followed the handwritten directions to a modest farmhouse overlooking rolling pasture. An older man repaired split cedar rails beneath the shade of a massive oak. Without looking up, he spoke. "Took you long enough." Caleb slowed. "You knew I was coming?" Noah Pierce smiled without stopping his work. "Martha called." He drove another nail. "Besides," he finally looked up, "you've got Walter's eyes." The two men sat on overturned feed buckets while Koda stretched beneath the oak tree. Noah listened carefully as Caleb described the abandoned cabin, the stone marker, and the metallic sound echoing through the valley. He didn't interrupt once. When Caleb finished, Noah leaned back slowly. "So, you heard it. You know what it was?" "No. But I know something else." He folded his hands. "For 30 years, people have been looking for something on Mercer Ridge." "What exactly?" "If I knew that," Noah chuckled softly, "I would have stopped wondering years ago." He grew serious again. Survey crews, investors, strangers asking questions they shouldn't. They come, they leave, but Walter never let any of them stay very long. Caleb stared across the fields. Why didn't he ever tell me? Noah's answer came almost as a whisper. Maybe he wasn't waiting for you to know. Maybe he was waiting until you needed to. Those words lingered in Caleb's mind as he climbed back into the pickup. Driving toward the valley again, he checked his mirrors out of habit. A quarter-mile behind him, the same dark SUV eased onto the highway. It stayed just far enough back to avoid attention. Close enough that Caleb knew it wasn't a coincidence anymore. Koda quietly stood up inside the cab. His eyes remained fixed on the mirror. Caleb checked it again. The dark SUV remained several hundred yards behind, matching every turn through the mountain highway without ever gaining ground. Whoever was driving knew exactly how close to stay without drawing attention. Caleb said nothing. Instead, he eased off the accelerator. The SUV slowed. He accelerated again. So did the SUV. Confirmation came without a single word. "They're not in a hurry," Caleb muttered. "They're making sure we go home." Koda gave a soft rumble deep in his chest. By the time they reached the broken gate of Mercer Ridge, the SUV continued down the county road without stopping. Gone. Or pretending to be. Caleb parked beside the old cabin and climbed out slowly. The afternoon breeze stirred the tops of the pines, carrying the faint smell of damp leaves after a passing shower. Nothing seemed different, yet everything felt watched. Rather than unpacking supplies, Caleb slipped a small, folding shovel into his backpack, tucked his notebook inside his jacket, and clipped a flashlight to his belt. Old routine. Never investigate empty-handed. Koda wasted no time. Instead of heading toward the cabin, the German shepherd trotted directly toward the weathered survey marker they had found the previous day. His pace was confident, purposeful, as though he already knew exactly where he wanted to go. Caleb followed. Beyond the marker, Koda pushed through dense rhododendron that reached nearly to Caleb's shoulders. The branches clawed gently at his jacket. The forest floor grew softer beneath layers of moss. Sunlight barely reached the ground. Then Koda stopped. He sniffed hard against the base of a massive chestnut stump before pawing at the earth. Leaves scattered. Dirt flew behind him. "What have you got?" Caleb knelt beside the dog. At first he saw only rocks tangled among thick roots. Then something straight caught his eye. Metal. He brushed away decades of packed soil until the corner of a rusted steel box emerged from beneath the roots. It was about the size of an old toolbox. No lock remained, only heavy corrosion. Carefully working the shovel beneath one edge, Caleb lifted it free. The hinges groaned before finally giving way. Inside, everything had been wrapped in oilcloth that somehow survived the passing decades. His hands slowed. Photographs. Black and white portraits of men standing beside newly planted orchards. Families smiling in front of cabins that no longer existed. Military uniforms unlike any he'd worn. Folded letters tied together with faded twine. And beneath everything, a tightly rolled, hand-drawn map. Caleb spread it across a flat rock. It wasn't like any survey map he'd ever seen. There were no road names, no property numbers. Instead, someone had sketched mountain ridges, streams, unusual rock formations, and symbols carved beside certain locations. One mark resembled the weathered stone marker behind them. Another pointed toward a ridge overlooking the valley. Several had been circled in red pencil. Koda remained unusually still. The dog's ears suddenly lifted. His head turned sharply uphill. Caleb noticed the change immediately. "What is it?" Silence. Even the birds had stopped. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Then, crack! A rifle shot shattered the quiet. The bullet slammed into an oak tree less than 6 feet from where Caleb had been kneeling. Wood exploded across the moss. Training took over before conscious thought. Caleb grabbed the map with one hand and rolled sideways behind the chestnut stump. "Down!" Koda was already moving. The German shepherd didn't panic. Instead, he darted toward a shallow depression hidden beneath thick ferns several yards away, then looked back only once. Waiting. Showing. Caleb understood immediately. Another shot echoed across the hillside. This one struck higher, showering bark onto the ground. He stayed low, moving exactly as he had years earlier through dangerous valleys overseas. Short bursts, keeping terrain between himself and the unknown shooter. Koda remained just ahead, never too far, never leaving him. Together they slid into the narrow depression. From there, the hillside above became nearly impossible to see. The firing stopped. Only wind stirred through the trees. Caleb controlled his breathing. He listened. No footsteps. No voices. Nothing except a distant raven calling somewhere beyond the ridge. Whoever had fired wasn't hunting. The spacing had been deliberate, measured, designed to force movement. He glanced down at the rolled map still clutched tightly beneath his arm. No random hunter could have known they would find it today. Which meant only one thing. Someone else already knew the map existed. Koda rested one paw against Caleb's knee. His breathing remained steady despite the danger. Caleb scratched gently behind the dog's ear. "You saved me again." The shepherd leaned quietly against him. After several minutes, Caleb carefully raised his head just enough to study the ridge through a narrow gap in the brush. Nothing. The shooter had vanished. Only 2 fresh scars remained on the oak tree where the bullets had struck. The mountains had welcomed him with silence. Now they had answered with gunfire. And somewhere beyond the trees, someone was determined to keep Mercer Ridge from giving up its secrets. Caleb waited nearly 20 minutes before leaving the shallow depression. He didn't stand immediately. Instead, he studied the slope through small gaps in the brush, letting his eyes adjust to every shadow. The hillside remained still, but experience had taught him that stillness could be carefully manufactured. Koda stayed low beside him. The shepherd's ears shifted constantly, catching sounds Caleb couldn't hear. Finally, Caleb whispered, "Let's move." They didn't return by the same route. Instead, Caleb followed the creek bed where rounded boulders concealed their tracks. Water muffled their footsteps, and dense mountain laurel blocked anyone watching from above. Old survival habits surfaced without effort. Avoid skylines. Never linger in open ground. Assume someone is observing. When they reached the cabin, Caleb paused before stepping into the clearing. Nothing appeared disturbed. Yet something felt wrong. Koda crossed the yard slowly, nose close to the ground. He stopped beside the truck, sniffed the driver's door, then followed a scent toward the rear tire. Caleb crouched beside him. Fresh boot prints, not his. The tread pattern was sharp, untouched by weather. Someone had walked around the pickup while they were gone. No broken windows. Nothing stolen. Whoever came hadn't wanted supplies. They wanted information. Caleb quietly checked inside the cab. His old duffel remained untouched. The camp stove sat exactly where he'd left it. But his folded county road map had been moved half an inch across the dashboard. Most people would never notice. He did. Someone had searched the truck carefully enough to avoid leaving obvious signs. Koda gave another low growl. "Yeah," Caleb murmured. "They're getting comfortable." By dusk, he had reinforced the cabin as best he could. Broken shutters were pulled closed with wire. A fallen timber became a brace across the back door. He positioned several empty tin cans on fishing line between nearby trees. Simple. Quiet. Enough to tell him if someone approached after dark. Dinner sat untouched for several minutes. His appetite had disappeared. As darkness settled over Mercer Ridge, the forest became a sea of black shapes moving gently in the wind. Sleep refused to come. Every creak of old wood echoed through the cabin. Every gust against the roof sounded like footsteps. Near midnight, clang. The same metallic sound rolled faintly through the valley. One strike, then another. Farther away this time. Caleb's heartbeat quickened before he could stop it. For an instant, the lantern light became the harsh white glare of floodlights. The smell of damp timber disappeared beneath burning diesel fuel. Voices barked across a radio. Incoming coordinates. He squeezed his eyes shut. No. Not here. Not now. A warm muzzle rested against his hand. Koda. The shepherd leaned gently against his leg until Caleb's breathing slowed. I'm okay. He wasn't completely sure, but the words helped. The metallic sound never came again. Just before dawn, exhaustion finally overtook him. He slept less than an hour. The crash of a falling branch snapped him awake. He was already on one knee before realizing where he was. Flashlight in one hand, pocket knife in the other. Koda stood at the window, silent, alert. Caleb followed the dog's gaze. Mud. Fresh mud clung to Koda's paws. He must have slipped outside through the damaged back door sometime before sunrise. What did you find? The shepherd walked toward the porch. Stopped. Looked back. Caleb grabbed his jacket. Koda led him along the eastern tree line, moving with steady purpose until they reached a narrow trail Caleb hadn't noticed before. There, impressed deeply into the soft earth, were several clear boot prints. Large, modern, not hiking boots, work boots, at least two different people. The tracks hadn't been there yesterday. Beside them lay a crushed cigarette filter still dry despite the morning dew. Recent. Very recent. Koda continued farther. 30 yards ahead, he stopped beside a patch of disturbed soil. Caleb knelt. A faint scent of motor oil lingered in the air. Someone had dragged heavy equipment through the underbrush within the last day or two. Not enough to leave tire tracks. Enough to flatten young ferns. He opened his notebook. Distance from cabin. Direction of travel. Boot size. Number of tracks. Wind direction. The habits of documenting details returned as naturally as breathing. People often overlooked small things. Small things kept soldiers alive. As he closed the notebook, Koda suddenly lifted his head again. His ears locked onto the ridge where the rifle shots had come from. The dog didn't bark. He simply stared, watching, waiting. Caleb looked toward the same hillside. Hidden among the trees, sunlight briefly reflected off something smooth. Glass. Only for a second. Then it disappeared. Someone with binoculars, or a rifle scope, had been watching them once again. The glint vanished before Caleb could raise his binoculars. Only the trees remained. A cool breeze swept across the ridge, stirring pine branches as if nothing had happened. Koda never looked away. The shepherd stood perfectly still, every muscle tense, until the hillside fell silent again. Caleb lowered his notebook. Not today. He wasn't chasing someone who knew the terrain better than he did. Instead, he folded the map they had recovered from the steel cache and drove into Ash Hollow before noon. Noah Pierce was repairing an old split-rail fence when Caleb arrived. One look at Caleb's face told the retired ranger something had changed. You found it. Caleb placed the hand-drawn map on the tailgate of the truck, and someone tried very hard to make sure I didn't. Noah carefully unfolded the brittle paper. For nearly a minute he said nothing. His weathered finger traced faded pencil marks across streams and ridges. I haven't seen this in over 40 years. You've seen one before? No. But Walter described it. He pointed toward several strange symbols Caleb hadn't recognized. These aren't property markers. What are they? They're trail signs. Old ones. Before the Forest Service mapped these mountains. Caleb leaned closer. Noah continued. Veterans built many of these trails after the First World War. They already knew how to move supplies through rough country. They used the same skills they learned overseas. Caleb looked again. The routes suddenly made more sense. Hidden approaches, natural cover, reliable water. Nothing random. Noah's finger stopped at a circle drawn near the northern ridge. I think this is where we're going. They hiked most of the afternoon. The climb grew steeper with every switchback. Massive boulders emerged through thick stands of hemlock. Several times Caleb noticed old stone steps nearly hidden beneath moss. Someone had shaped the mountain long ago. Koda led without hesitation. Whenever the trail divided, he chose one path immediately, as though guided by a scent lingering across generations. Late in the day, they reached a collapsed stone structure tucked beneath an overhanging cliff. From a distance, it resembled nothing more than a pile of fallen rock. Up close, straight walls became visible beneath vines. This wasn't a cabin, Noah whispered. It was built into the mountain. Together they cleared fallen branches from the entrance. Cool air drifted from the darkness inside. The shelter was surprisingly large. Stone shelves lined one wall. A rusted lantern still hung from an iron hook. Near the back rested an old cedar chest, protected beneath layers of dust. Its lid opened with surprising ease. Inside lay several leather-bound journals wrapped carefully in oilcloth. Caleb lifted the first one. The handwriting was neat despite its age. The opening page read, Spring, 1921. Noah adjusted his glasses while Caleb began reading aloud. The journal belonged to a man named Thomas Mercer, Caleb's great-grandfather. Page after page described soldiers returning home after the Great War. Some had lost limbs. Others carried wounds no one could see. Many had nowhere to go. Together they purchased forgotten mountain land no one else wanted. Not to grow rich, to disappear, to heal. They planted orchards, built cabins, cut irrigation channels, created trails wide enough for wagons carrying supplies. Every entry spoke less about buildings than about people rebuilding themselves. One passage stopped Caleb cold. If another generation returns from another war carrying burdens, they cannot speak aloud. This valley must remain waiting. Men recover more slowly when the world rushes them. Caleb closed his eyes. The words felt impossibly personal, as though someone writing a century earlier somehow understood nights spent staring into darkness, waiting for sounds that never came. Noah quietly opened another journal. His expression changed. You should read this. Inside was an account dated 7 years later. Several wealthy land buyers had discovered the valley. They wanted the timber, the fresh mountain springs, the fertile soil. When the veterans refused to sell, intimidation followed. Survey markers disappeared. Property records were challenged. Threats arrived. Finally, the families reached a difficult decision. They would erase the valley from ordinary memory. Trails were abandoned on maps. Buildings hidden beneath growing forest. Only trusted descendants would someday know where to look. Caleb stared around the shelter. The silence suddenly carried new meaning. This place hadn't been forgotten by accident. It had been protected. Koda, who had been sniffing quietly along the back wall, suddenly pawed at a loose stone. Caleb knelt beside him. Behind it rested a small tin box. Inside lay a folded note in Walter Mercer's unmistakably careful handwriting. Only one sentence appeared. If you're standing here, they finally know the valley still exists. Caleb slowly folded the paper. Outside, the evening wind swept through the trees. For the first time, the attacks, the strangers, the hidden map, and the watching eyes all fit together. The inheritance had never been about worthless land. Someone had spent 100 years protecting a promise, and someone else had spent decades trying to destroy it. The hike back to the cabin passed in silence. Caleb carried the journals inside a waterproof pack strapped tightly against his chest. Every few minutes he glanced over his shoulder without thinking. Koda stayed several yards ahead, pausing at every bend in the trail until Caleb caught up. The shepherd wasn't leading anymore. He was screening the route. By late afternoon, they reached the cabin. Nothing appeared disturbed. The fishing line still stretched between the trees. The empty cans remained exactly where Caleb had tied them. Still, he walked a slow circle around the clearing before unlocking the door. No fresh tracks, no broken branches, no unusual scent except pine and damp earth. Only then did he step inside. The old journals remained spread across the rough wooden table long after sunset. Caleb carefully photographed every page using his phone while it still had enough battery. Experience had taught him that documents could disappear. Copies survived. Around 8 o'clock, headlights swept across the cabin windows. Koda stood instantly. One bark, short, controlled. Caleb switched off the lantern before moving to the side of the window instead of standing in front of it. A black luxury pickup rolled slowly into the clearing. Not the dark SUV. Someone else. A middle-aged man stepped out wearing expensive hiking boots that had clearly never crossed a muddy trail. Another man climbed from the passenger side carrying a leather briefcase. Neither looked surprised to see the cabin occupied. The first man smiled politely. "Mr. Mercer?" Caleb opened the door but remained on the porch. "That's me." The visitor removed a business card. "Daniel Harlow, Regional Director, Blue Ridge Resource Development." He extended his hand. Caleb glanced at it, then nodded without shaking. "What brings you all the way out here?" Daniel never lost his smile. "We heard the Mercer property had changed ownership. Thought we'd introduce ourselves." The second man spoke. "My name's Victor Sloan. I'm legal counsel for the company." Everything about him sounded rehearsed. Koda quietly positioned himself beside Caleb's leg. Watching. Victor opened the briefcase. "We understand inheriting remote land can become complicated." He removed several neatly organized folders. "Our company has acquired surrounding properties over the years. We'd like to save you considerable trouble." Daniel handed Caleb a printed offer. The number stopped him for a moment. $3 million. For land everyone insisted was worthless. Caleb looked back up. "That's generous." Daniel smiled wider. "We believe in investing ahead of growth." Caleb folded the paper once. "You've never even walked the property. We've conducted extensive surveys." Victor answered this time. "Satellite imagery. Historical assessments." Caleb noticed it immediately. Historical assessments. Only someone familiar with the hidden history would choose those words so casually. He asked quietly, "What exactly do you think you're buying?" For the first time, Daniel hesitated. Only a fraction of a second. "Enough." Victor stepped in smoothly. "Mostly timber. Future recreational potential. Nothing particularly unusual." Caleb leaned against the porch railing. "Funny. The county attorney called it worthless. You call it worth $3 million. So one of you is wrong." Neither man answered immediately. Instead, Victor opened another folder. "There is another concern." He slid several photocopies across the porch. "Some ownership boundaries appear questionable. The original surveys contain inconsistencies. There may be competing historical claims. If litigation begins..." He paused deliberately. "Legal costs alone could consume years." Daniel added softly, We'd hate to see a veteran lose everything over paperwork. Caleb looked at the survey maps. Something bothered him immediately. The Western Creek had been drawn nearly 300 yards from its actual location. An entire stone terrace shown on the journals was missing. Even the abandoned orchard had disappeared. Not mistakes, omissions, intentional ones. His eyes moved to Victor. "You've never walked this land." Victor blinked. "We've relied on professional surveyors." "No." Caleb tapped one corner of the map. "This ridgeline blocks line of sight. You marked it as open terrain." He pointed farther north. "You erased an entire spring, then another spot. And your elevation contour here," he shook his head, "doesn't exist." Silence settled across the porch. Daniel slowly folded his hands. "You notice details?" "I used to," Caleb answered simply. Koda suddenly growled. Not at Daniel. At the briefcase. Victor instinctively shifted it behind one leg. The movement lasted barely a second, but Caleb caught it. So did Koda. The dog stepped forward one pace, his ears locked. Victor stopped smiling. Daniel cleared his throat. "Our offer stands for 30 days. I wouldn't wait too long." He reached into his pocket and handed Caleb another envelope. Inside was a formal letter. It warned that unresolved title defects could place future ownership at risk. Everything looked official. Everything smelled like pressure. The visitors climbed back into the pickup. As they drove away, Caleb watched the dust settle over the road. Only after the engine disappeared did he unfold the company's survey map again. Something caught his eye. One tiny notation in the lower corner. Project Falcon Ridge. Not Mercer Ridge. A project name. Not a property description. Which meant one thing. Blue Ridge Resource Development hadn't just discovered the valley. They had already been planning something long before Walter Mercer died. Koda quietly rested his head against Caleb's arm. The old shepherd's eyes remained fixed on the road long after the truck had vanished. As though he knew. This visit had not been an offer. It had been a warning. Caleb watched the dust settle long after the black pickup disappeared beyond the trees. Koda remained beside him, ears forward, his attention fixed on the road, until the last sound of the engine faded into the mountains. "They're running out of patience," Caleb said quietly. The shepherd glanced up as if he understood every word. That evening, Caleb packed the journals into a weatherproof container beneath loose floorboards inside the cabin. He kept only the hand-drawn map folded inside his jacket. If someone broke in again, they wouldn't find everything in one place. Rain arrived just after sunset, a slow mountain rain that tapped gently against the metal roof. For the first time in several days, Caleb almost relaxed. The weather masked distant sounds. Anyone moving through the woods would leave tracks. He built a small fire inside the stone fireplace while Koda stretched beside it, the orange glow reflecting softly in the dog's dark eyes. Caleb studied Walter's note again. "If you're standing here, they finally know the valley still exists." He wondered how long Walter had lived with that burden. Years, maybe decades. The lantern flickered. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the western ridge. The sound carried Caleb somewhere else. For one brief moment, the rain became rotor wash. The cabin walls disappeared beneath blinding flashes. Someone shouted for a medic. A young corporal reached toward him through dust thick enough to taste. Caleb's breathing shortened. His fingers tightened around the edge of the table. A warm weight rested against his knee. "Koda." The shepherd leaned gently into him without making a sound. Caleb closed his eyes until the memory loosened its grip. "I'm here." He wasn't sure whether he was reassuring himself or the dog. Near midnight, the rain stopped. Silence settled over Mercer Ridge. Then Koda's head lifted. His ears turned toward the back of the cabin. One low growl, not loud, certain. Caleb extinguished the lantern immediately. Darkness filled the room. He waited. There. A faint snap. Not a branch falling. A careful footstep. Then another. Someone was outside. Caleb moved to the rear window without crossing in front of it. Years of training returned effortlessly. Stay off the silhouette. Use reflections. Watch before moving. Through a narrow crack between the shutters, he caught the outline of a flashlight sweeping briefly across the orchard before disappearing again. Whoever it was knew enough not to leave the beam on, professional or experienced. The footsteps faded. After nearly 15 minutes, Caleb opened the back door. Koda. The shepherd slipped silently into the darkness. Caleb followed at a distance, keeping low beneath the trees. The moon broke through scattered clouds just enough to reveal shapes along the old trail. Koda moved confidently, then suddenly stopped. His body stiffened. His nose worked rapidly. Caleb noticed something stretched low between two saplings. Wire. Thin. Nearly invisible. His pulse quickened. Someone had rigged a trip line across the trail. Before he could warn the dog, movement exploded from the darkness. A frightened deer burst through the brush. The animal struck the wire first. A heavy deadfall log, suspended above the trail, swung violently downward. Koda! The shepherd lunged, not away from danger, but toward Caleb. He slammed into Caleb's legs with all his strength. The impact knocked Caleb backward onto the damp ground. The log crashed where he had been standing a heartbeat earlier. But Koda wasn't fast enough. One end of the swinging timber caught the dog's left shoulder before crashing into the earth. A sharp yelp shattered the night. Koda! Caleb crawled to him immediately. The shepherd struggled to stand, but stumbled. Dark blood spread through the wet fur near his shoulder. Caleb's hands moved automatically. Pressure first. Check breathing. No obvious fractures. The cut was deep but clean. He tore open the field medical kit he always carried. Years earlier, those same hands had packed wounds beneath enemy fire. Tonight, they shook more than they ever had overseas. Stay with me, buddy. Koda never snapped, never cried again. He simply rested his head against Caleb's arm while Caleb flushed the wound with sterile water and wrapped it tightly with a compression bandage. When the bleeding finally slowed, Caleb sat back against a tree. Rainwater dripped quietly from the branches. His heartbeat still hadn't settled. He looked at the trap. It wasn't built to catch deer. It had been placed exactly where a person following the trail would walk in darkness. Someone had studied their routine. Someone expected Caleb to investigate noises behind the cabin. As dawn approached, Caleb carried Koda the final stretch back to the cabin, rather than asking him to walk farther. The shepherd protested only once before quietly accepting the help. Hours later, while gathering himself enough to inspect the trail again, Caleb noticed something beyond the broken deadfall. Fresh tire tracks. Wide off-road tires. They led toward a narrow ridge hidden behind dense pines. The strange part wasn't the tracks. It was where they disappeared. According to every modern county map, there wasn't supposed to be any road there at all. Caleb studied the tire tracks for several long moments. The tread was deep, built for rough terrain, but the edges remained crisp despite the night's rain. Whoever had driven here had done so only hours earlier. He knelt beside the tracks. Fresh mud still clung to broken stones. No leaves had settled into them. Recent. Very recent. Koda limped to his side. The bandage around his left shoulder had already darkened, where a little blood had seeped through, but the old shepherd refused to stay behind. He sniffed the ground carefully, then looked toward the hidden ridge. You should be resting. Caleb said quietly. Koda answered by taking 3 determined steps forward. Caleb smiled despite everything. I figured you'd say that. He adjusted the dog's bandage one more time before securing his own backpack. Inside were the journals, a flashlight, water, a first aid kit, and the old hand-drawn map. The map showed no road. Only a faint symbol near the ridge, a circle crossed by a single vertical line. The same symbol appeared nowhere else. They followed the tire tracks slowly. Caleb never walked directly in them. Instead, he moved parallel through the trees, using trunks and boulders as cover whenever the terrain opened. The habits of a combat engineer never truly disappeared. Observe first, move second. Expose yourself only when necessary. Nearly half a mile later, the trees began thinning. The hidden trail climbed toward a rocky overlook where the skeletal remains of an old fire lookout tower rose above the forest. Only part of the wooden frame remained standing. Its roof had long ago collapsed. Lightning scars split several support beams, yet the stone foundation looked remarkably intact. This is what the symbol meant. Koda reached the tower first. Instead of entering, he circled it once, then again. His injured leg caused a slight limp, but his nose never left the ground. Suddenly, he stopped near one corner of the foundation. He pawed twice at a broad, flat stone. Caleb crouched beside him. The stone looked no different from the others, except for one detail. Its edges were cleaner, less weathered. Someone had moved it before. He slipped the blade of his folding shovel beneath one side and pushed. At first, nothing happened. Then the slab shifted with a dull scrape. Cold air drifted upward. A narrow stone staircase disappeared into darkness below. Caleb switched on his flashlight. The beam revealed dry masonry descending beneath the tower. No wonder nobody found it. The entrance had been hidden perfectly beneath the foundation itself. He looked at Koda. You stay close. Together they descended. The air grew cooler with every step. Dust floated through the flashlight beam untouched by wind. No footprints marked the floor. No signs of recent visitors. The staircase ended inside a surprisingly large underground chamber built from hand-cut stone. Wooden shelves lined the walls. Most had collapsed with age. Several iron tools rested exactly where someone had left them generations ago. At the center of the room stood a heavy oak chest reinforced with black iron bands. Unlike the steel cache they had already discovered, this chest remained locked, or had been. The lock had rusted completely through. Caleb lifted the lid carefully. Inside lay dozens of leather document folders stacked with remarkable care. Beneath them rested rolled engineering drawings tied with faded blue ribbon. He opened the nearest folder. Original land deeds. Every parcel surrounding Mercer Ridge had been purchased legally between 1919 and 1924. Each deed carried county seals still clearly visible. Another folder contained trust documents signed by returning veterans who had pooled their military pay to preserve the valley. Caleb slowly turned another page. Detailed engineering plans appeared. Stone bridges, water channels, drainage systems, orchards, cabins. Everything had been designed not merely to survive, but to support people rebuilding their lives. Near the bottom of the chest rested a smaller cedar box. Inside lay several personal letters bundled together. The first was addressed simply to whoever keeps the valley. Caleb unfolded the fragile paper. The handwriting belonged to Walter Mercer. If these papers are being read, then the valley has reached another crossroads. There will come people who speak politely while trying to steal what others built through sacrifice. Do not mistake expensive suits for honest intentions. They will claim progress. They will promise prosperity. Ask them one question. Why do they want forgotten land so badly? If they cannot answer honestly, You already have. Caleb let the letter rest in his lap. The room fell silent except for Koda's slow breathing. The shepherd had wandered toward the rear wall. He sniffed between two shelves before sitting quietly. Caleb aimed the flashlight. Carved into the stone behind Koda were hundreds of names. Not random visitors, veterans, each followed by a year. Names spanning generations. Every caretaker had added another. Walter Mercer was the most recent. Below Walter's name, one final space had been left blank. Caleb reached out and ran his fingers across the untouched stone. For the first time since arriving in Mercer Ridge, he understood completely. The inheritance was never about ownership. It was about stewardship. And somewhere beyond the hidden chamber, someone who knew nothing about sacrifice was still trying to claim everything those names had protected for more than a century. Caleb carefully closed the oak chest. He photographed every deed, every engineering drawing, every page of the trust documents before placing them back exactly as he had found them. Years of solving battlefield problems had taught him one lesson above all others. Never carry the only copy of anything important if it could disappear. Koda waited patiently at the foot of the stone stairs. Though his shoulder still pained him, his tail moved once when Caleb approached. "You've earned a long rest," Caleb said softly. The shepherd leaned against his leg instead. Outside, afternoon sunlight poured across the mountains, making the valley appear peaceful enough to hide every secret it carried. The peace lasted less than an hour. As Caleb reached the cabin, another vehicle waited near the broken gate. Not the development company's truck. A dusty gray SUV with government plates. A woman in her early 50s stepped out, carrying a leather satchel instead of a briefcase. She wore hiking boots that had clearly seen real trails. "You must be Caleb Mercer." "I am." She offered a business card. "Rebecca Lang, Veterans Legal Assistance Project." Caleb glanced at the card. "I didn't ask for a lawyer." "No." She smiled gently. But Noah Pierce did. Caleb relaxed only slightly. "Come inside." The journals covered the cabin table once again. Rebecca examined them carefully, reading only a few pages before removing her glasses. "These aren't just family records," I figured. "They're evidence." She unfolded one of the original land deeds. The county seal is authentic. She compared it with another document. The trust was properly recorded. Another page. So was the conservation agreement. Caleb frowned. "Then why does the company say my ownership isn't clear?" Rebecca reached into her satchel and removed several modern property records she had obtained that morning. She spread them beside the originals. "Because someone has been quietly changing history." She pointed toward a boundary description. "This creek was moved on paper." Another page. Entire parcels were merged without referencing the original deeds. Then another. "Here." She tapped the document with one finger. "The signatures are genuine. The filing dates are not." Caleb looked closer. He saw it immediately. Documents supposedly recorded years apart all carried identical formatting and printing methods. Someone had rebuilt old records using modern filings. Carefully, gradually, almost invisibly. Rebecca nodded. "I've seen this before. Usually corporations don't steal land overnight. They move one legal line at a time. Eventually no one remembers where the original line ever was." A pickup approached outside. Noah climbed onto the porch carrying an old metal cash box. "I thought you ought to see these." Inside lay decades of canceled tax receipts. Walter Mercer had paid property taxes every single year, sometimes only days before penalties would have been assessed, sometimes in cash, sometimes by money order, never missing a payment. Rebecca smiled quietly. "This destroys one of their biggest arguments. Noah removed one final envelope from the box. I found this underneath. It contained handwritten notes from Walter. Not emotional letters. Simple records. Dates. Names. License plate numbers. Meetings with strangers asking to buy the valley. Conversations with survey crews. Repeated visits by representatives connected to Blue Ridge Resource Development, stretching back nearly 18 years. 18 years, Caleb whispered. They've been planning this since long before Walter passed away. Rebecca nodded. And probably before they knew you'd inherit. One entry near the end caught Caleb's attention. Walter had written only a single sentence beneath a date from 5 years earlier. They finally admitted what they truly want. Not the timber, not the land, the water. Rebecca looked up immediately. The springs. Caleb remembered every engineering drawing beneath the watchtower, every irrigation channel, every reservoir carefully built into the mountainside. Noah folded his arms. Those springs feed half the lower valley during dry summers. Rebecca continued. If a company controlled that water. She didn't need to finish. Caleb already understood. The valley had never been valuable because of what stood above the ground. Its greatest wealth flowed beneath it. Just before sunset, another unexpected knock echoed against the cabin door. A young man stood outside wearing work clothes with the Blue Ridge Company logo stitched onto the pocket. He removed his cap nervously. I shouldn't be here. His voice barely rose above a whisper. But I helped survey these mountains. He glanced over his shoulder before continuing. The company already knows about the old watchtower. Caleb's expression hardened. They've known for years. The young surveyor swallowed. They just never found what was underneath. He reached into his jacket and handed Caleb a folded photocopy. It was an internal planning map. Across the center of Mercer Ridge, printed in bold red letters, appeared 4 words. Falcon Ridge Water Project. The truth struck harder than any rifle shot. This had never been about forgotten land. It had never even been about timber. Someone intended to control the mountain's water supply, and they had spent nearly 2 decades rewriting history to make it happen. The cabin remained quiet long after the young surveyor left. His truck disappeared down the mountain road without its headlights, as if he feared even the darkness might recognize him. Rebecca carefully folded the photocopied project map. We're finished collecting evidence, she said. Now we protect it. Caleb nodded. For the first time since arriving on Mercer Ridge, he no longer felt like a man wandering through unanswered questions. The pieces fit. Walter hadn't left him forgotten land. He had left him a responsibility. Within days, Rebecca filed emergency motions with the county court, attaching copies of the original deeds, tax receipts, trust agreements, engineering plans, and photographs from the hidden vault. Noah provided sworn testimony describing decades of Walter's stewardship, while the young surveyor submitted an affidavit confirming Blue Ridge executives had discussed the valley years before Caleb inherited it. The company's response came quickly. Their attorneys demanded private negotiations. Rebecca refused. If they wanted the truth, she said, they would have started there. Instead, depositions began. One by one, old records surfaced. Former employees admitted historical boundary maps had been updated to simplify future development. A retired county clerk remembered repeated requests to review Mercer Ridge files. Even Daniel Harlow, after hours of questioning, quietly admitted his company had tracked Walter Mercer's health for years, believing the property would eventually become available. Not once did anyone deny the existence of Project Falcon Ridge. They simply insisted it served the public interest. The judge ordered every disputed filing preserved while the investigation continued. For the first time, the pressure eased. The black SUV never returned. No strange footsteps circled the cabin. Even the mountains seemed to breathe differently. One rainy evening, while organizing Walter's journals, Caleb discovered something he had somehow overlooked. The cedar chest contained a false bottom. It lifted with only the slightest pressure. Inside rested a single cream-colored envelope. Across the front, written in careful handwriting, were the words, "For the one who arrives with a loyal dog instead of a lawyer." Caleb sat quietly beside the fireplace. Koda lay at his feet, his shoulder nearly healed, though a thin scar remained beneath the fur. Caleb opened the envelope carefully. The paper crackled with age. "My dear family, if you are reading this, then I was right." The valley waited, not for the strongest, not for the richest. For someone who still understands loyalty. "You probably believe I chose you because we share a name. I didn't. I chose you because every report I quietly received over the years said the same thing. You never abandoned your dog. A man who stays beside an old friend after losing everything usually remembers how to stand beside strangers who have lost everything too." Caleb stopped reading. His vision blurred. He rested the letter on his knee until the fire came back into focus. Outside, thunder rolled softly across the mountains. For an instant, his shoulders tightened. His breathing shortened. Koda quietly stood, walked to him, and rested his head across Caleb's lap. No panic. No commands. Only quiet certainty. Caleb placed one hand on the shepherd's neck. The thunder faded. So did the memory it had stirred. He continued reading. "Do not mistake this valley for property. It is a promise. Every cabin, every orchard, every trail was built because broken soldiers deserve more than applause. They deserve time, silence, work, friendship, and a place where no one asks them to explain the nights they cannot sleep. If you protect that, then you have honored every Mercer before you. If someday another veteran arrives carrying burdens too heavy to name, tell him to stay. The valley already knows how to help." Caleb folded the letter slowly. He stared into the fire until the flames settled into glowing embers. For years after returning from Afghanistan, people had thanked him for his service. Few had ever asked what happened after the uniform came off. Walter had, without ever meeting the man he eventually became. The following morning arrived clear and cool. Sunlight spilled across the orchard as mist drifted above the creek. For the first time in years, Caleb had slept nearly 6 uninterrupted hours. Not because the nightmares had disappeared, because when they came, he no longer faced them alone. Koda walked beside him to the ridge overlooking the valley. The shepherd stopped where the old watchtower stood against the morning sky. Caleb looked across the cabins hidden beneath the trees, the stone terraces, the winding streams, and the forests that had quietly guarded generations of wounded souls. Walter had trusted him with more than land. He had trusted him with hope, and Caleb intended to keep that promise. Autumn arrived quietly on Mercer Ridge. The first frost silvered the grass each morning, while smoke curled from the repaired chimney of the old cabin. The valley no longer felt abandoned. Hammers echoed where silence once ruled. Chainsaws cut only fallen timber, never healthy trees. Neighbors from Ash Hollow appeared on weekends carrying lumber, windows, blankets, and food without asking for anything in return. Noah Pierce organized trail crews the way he once organized forest volunteers decades earlier. One bridge at a time, he would remind everyone. That's how you cross a mountain. Martha Ellis kept the workers supplied with fresh bread, hot coffee, and enough pies that no one ever left hungry. Rebecca Lang continued working with county officials until the final court order arrived. Every altered boundary filed by Blue Ridge Resource Development was overturned. The original deeds were restored. The veterans' trust regained full legal protection. Mercer Ridge would never become Falcon Ridge. The company quietly abandoned its development plans after state investigators opened their own inquiry into the manipulated records. Caleb never celebrated. Winning in court wasn't what mattered most. One crisp November morning, he walked through the orchard carrying a small bucket of apple saplings grown from trees planted nearly a century earlier. Koda followed beside him. The shepherd's shoulder had healed well. A narrow scar remained beneath the thick fur, but his stride had become steady again. Every now and then he would slow, glance back toward Caleb, then continue as though making certain his friend was still there. Together, they planted the first new trees in generations. Winter came early that year. Snow settled softly across the stone terraces and blanketed the roofs of the restored cabins. One evening, just after sunset, an aging pickup pulled into the valley. The driver climbed out slowly. He looked younger than Caleb, perhaps in his early 40s, though exhaustion had aged his face beyond his years. A faded army duffel rested in the truck bed. He hesitated before speaking. "I heard..." His voice nearly failed him. "Someone said veterans could stay here." Caleb studied him for only a moment. The restless eyes, the stiff shoulders, the way he instinctively checked every tree line before looking at another person. He recognized all of it. He had once carried it himself. "You've eaten yet?" Caleb asked. The younger veteran blinked. "No." "Then let's fix that first. No questions about deployments. No questions about medals. No questions about why he had nowhere else to go. Only a warm cabin, a hot meal, a quiet place to sit." Koda walked toward the stranger with slow, careful steps. The shepherd sniffed the man's hand, then gently leaned against his leg. For the first time that evening, the man's shoulders relaxed. "I think he likes you," Caleb said. The veteran smiled faintly. "I don't think I've smiled in a while." Inside the largest cabin, firelight danced across the stone fireplace that veterans from another century had built with their own hands. The old journals rested safely inside a glass cabinet beside Walter Mercer's final letter. Above them hung a simple wooden sign Noah had carved. "Leave no one behind." Caleb looked around the room. The empty chairs were slowly filling. A widow whose husband had served in Iraq now managed the kitchen. A retired Navy corpsman repaired roofs. A young family stayed in one of the restored cabins while rebuilding their lives after losing everything in a wildfire. No one asked how long anyone planned to stay. Healing never followed a calendar. Later that night, Caleb stepped outside. Snowflakes drifted through the quiet valley. Koda joined him beneath the stars. The shepherd walked ahead toward the old footbridge crossing the creek. He stopped in the middle and looked back, just as he had done the first day they arrived. Beyond him stretched the orchards, the trails, the cabins, and the mountains that had protected this place for more than 100 years. Caleb rested one hand on the weathered railing. Months earlier, he had arrived believing he was inheriting worthless land. Instead, he had inherited purpose. He had found a family built by strangers. He had discovered that the greatest legacies were measured not by money, but by the lives quietly changed after everyone else stopped paying attention. Koda sat beside him, watching the valley with calm, knowing eyes. Perhaps the old shepherd had sensed it from the very beginning. The mountains had never been waiting for hidden treasure. They had been waiting for someone willing to continue a promise. Together, the veteran and his loyal dog crossed the bridge one last time, disappearing into the warm lights of the valley that would never again be forgotten. If this story touched your heart, I have one simple favor to ask. Comment 1 if you believe every veteran deserves a place where they can find peace again. Or comment Koda to show some love for the loyal dog who never gave up on his best friend. I read your comments every day, and I'd truly love to know you're here. If you enjoy heartfelt stories about courage, loyalty, second chances, and the incredible bond between veterans and their dogs. Please subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next story. Thank you for spending your time with me today. Until next time, take care of yourself, and never underestimate the quiet power of kindness.